I would say like almost anything that is relevant in the cultural moment has a potential to take on a very political, very partisan character. So in terms of the intersection, the line is almost becoming indistinguishable between what you would call regular marketing, ESG, and then things that you would consider more political stands ultimately. So that is a very real issue that I think brands and executives are having to contend with, for better or for worse.
Welcome to On Record PR, where we go on record with industry leaders to discuss best practices for public relations strategies that drive business success. Let's get started with the show.
Welcome to On Record PR. I'm your host, Gina Rubel. Today, I'm going on record with Matthew, aka Matt Krayton, who is the founder of Publitics, a public affairs, political PR, and strategy consultancy. Matt provides counsel to campaigns, candidates, elected officials, executives, founders, organizations, and brands. Most recently, he worked with Biden for president on special projects, including having helped create the viral "We Just Did" hat and collateral for endorsements, including NBA star Ben Simmons. That's very impressive. His work on the campaign was recognized with a Campaigns and Elections magazine Stanley F Reed Award. Matt is an adjunct professor in Centenary University's business department, teaching in their first of its kind social media program. Prior to founding Publitics, Matt worked at Fairleigh Dickinson University's Public Mind Poll. He later taught freshman seminar for political science students and law in the liberal arts program as an adjunct instructor. Welcome to On Record PR, Matt.
Thank you, Gina. Appreciate you having me on.
It's so fun to speak to peers, and especially in areas that we don't provide PR services like politics and politicians and political campaigns. So how did you get into public affairs and political consulting?
Oh, that's a really interesting story. So I'll go back a little bit, which feels like ancient history at this point. So I feel like I'm dating myself. But I initially went to undergrad and did my master's degree in education. So my undergrad was like history, political science. I wanted to be a history teacher, secondary ed. Always had some interest in politics. Was really fascinated by the study of politics. Had a couple of great professors who brought the subject to life. So I was like, oh, politics is interesting, but I was like, I'm going to be a teacher. So, I worked my way through school, did the whole student teaching thing, got certified. But then there was a little thing in 2008 that happened, the financial meltdown, the financial crisis. So by the time I had graduated in 2010 with my undergrad, there really weren't any jobs available, especially for history teachers, right? So if you're math and science, there was still some hope, but otherwise, a ton of people had been laid off at that point. And so you were competing against people with 5-10 years of experience. So I'm sitting there. I feel like this is a typical kind of millennial sort of career story here, but I'm sitting there going, career prospects, not much going on right there on the teaching side. Plus, I had some apprehension about amount of like paperwork that went along with teaching, which is kind of an interesting thing. So shout out to all those teachers out there who are, dealing with all of that stuff. It's really tough work. So I certainly appreciate that. But, sitting there looking at the landscape and combine that with some apprehension, I was like, all right, I'm going to take the first job that I can find, whatever it is. Like I'm going to apply to a whole bunch of stuff. So I ended up applying to the university that I went to, Fairleigh Dickinson University, and ended up in the alumni affairs department. So this is kind of a roundabout way of how I got there. So as I was doing the alumni affairs work, which really kind of consisted of calling through lists of people asking them for money, and as you can imagine, people weren't especially receptive, especially at this time, to giving. I have student loans, and then there was some other choice language, directed by the people I spoke to. So I'm sitting there and, thinking to myself, I don't love this. And sure enough, about 10 months later, the position was eliminated entirely. So during this whole time, I was thinking, I kind of want to do my own thing. I always liked politics. In grad school, I had worked at the Public Mind Poll, got my feet wet and trying to in public opinion research, which was really interesting. So understanding what makes the public tick, understanding what influences voter behavior from sort of a quantitative and qualitative perspective. So at that point, I was like, well, why don't I start my own thing and just see where I end up? So I started Publitics in 2011, and I at that point had no idea how I was going to find clients. So my first step was, all right, I have to find like at least one or two races to work on. And then I thought to myself, well, what are people going to trust me to do? Because like I have no experience other than having worked at the Public Mind Poll, but they're not going to bring me on as like the principal campaign manager or anything like that on a big race. So I did two things. So I was able to pick up a local town council race. And then there was a race for Congress. What I thought was, well, if I pick a sure loser, like someone who's absolutely going to lose, then they'd be more open to hiring someone like me, because what is there to lose at that point? You know, they're not on any of the big, targeted race lists. So I was like, all right, let's pick a losing campaign. And I'm going to tell them I do digital strategy because I'm young. I'm a millennial. They'll look at me, they'll go, oh yeah, you must know how to do social media. So at that point, I like had an intuitive sense, like most people, sort of, we grew up on the cusp of social media, right? So like we went from like not really having like internet in the house to like having Facebook in our senior year of high school into freshman year of college. So it's like, I know this stuff. I think I can do this. So anyway, they hired me, and I had the opportunity to try out a whole bunch of different stuff online on Facebook in terms of fundraising. Had some actual moderate success in developing a digital program on that race. But as I had suspected, that particular candidate lost, went down in flames, as expected, very tough districts, but got a lot of great experience. The other campaign, the town council campaign, surprisingly, ended up being a winner. So it was sort of a shock winner. People kind of looked around and were like, oh, well, that's pretty impressive. So from that point forward, I started picking up a lot of different local races, bouncing around to different things. I was able to kind of network with different people. There were a couple of, it's interestingly enough, this was all during Superstorm Sandy at this point when I was doing these two races. So one of what I would say lucky or big breaks in my career was I was able to connect with a gentleman in my area who had worked for Senator Lautenberg, Frank Lautenberg, who I was trying to chase down a mail-in ballot at that point. So I was like, make sure you return your ballot or apply for a ballot at that time. Anyway, so we were going back and forth on Twitter DMs, and then all the power went out during Sandy, and there was one bar in town that still had the lights on. So he was like, hey, do you want to just meet and catch up and talk? And so I met up with him. He ended up being a mentor, and sort of everything continued to roll on from there. So that is the long version of how I got into politics. Was sort of a roundabout way, but I've had the opportunity to learn a lot along the way. And then in 2014, I brought on my partner, Henry, who helps run Publitics with me. And we both met on a race for Congress that year as well. So it's been an interesting ride from there, but, haven't looked back, and we've been lucky to continue to work on really exciting, challenging races ever since, and then parlay that into working with private sector clients as well.
It's fascinating to me how many people I talk to who are leaders in public relations who have worked in some way in fundraising in their alumni offices. I did those calls in college, and then I was on the board at Drexel on the alumni board. And so it's a lot of work, and it really does it's a great place to cut your teeth, to start to learn, to build those networks, to have those conversations with people. So we have that in common. One of the things that was interesting that you said, and I don't have a schedule of questions, is that back, so we're in different generations. You're a millennial, I'm a Gen Xer. And in Superstorm Sandy, I was handling crisis communications for clients all over the East Coast. Meanwhile, we were in the same crisis, right? We lost the side of our building. Oh, yeah. So it was just, but you mentioned you were using Twitter then. So I'm going to ask the big question. Are you still active on Twitter now that the landscape has changed?
Not as much, honestly. So what I'll say is personally, I am a big lurker on Twitter, right? So I keep tabs because it's still to me relevant, but I don't find personally a whole lot of value in engaging as much on Twitter personally. And that was before all of the recent developments with Elon Musk taking over. So it really didn't have as much to do with that. For clients, we do use Twitter in certain circumstances, but I mean, I think we're always kind of weighing that versus the overall resources that we have available to focus on different things. And that usually ends up being pretty low on the list unless there's some very specific applications. So for me on Twitter, I'm not a huge Twitter user. There is a very specific audience on Twitter. It's, influencers, insiders, journalists, and that is valuable in some ways. But for the effort that you need to put in to be a Twitter personality, we just didn't really invest in that. And I don't regret it, to be honest with you. So
no, I've stopped investing time in Twitter altogether, even with journalists. I find that they're more active on literal Facebook and LinkedIn as well. So another question, how are businesses and politics intersecting, and how does it impact strategy for executives and brands, in your opinion?
That is the $1 billion question potentially here. So my answer is almost everything is political these days, and things that you think might not be political end up being political, right? So I would say almost anything that is relevant in the cultural moment has a potential to take on a very political, very partisan character. So I would say that in terms of the intersection, it's the line is almost becoming indistinguishable between what you would call regular marketing, ESG, and then things that you would consider more political stands ultimately. So that is a very real issue that I think brands and executives are having to contend with, for better or for worse. And the second piece of that too is you have consumers who are increasingly expecting executive leaders, brands to weigh in on issues that are, again, relevant to the cultural moment that we're in. So it's a tough challenge because I think the reality is, and this is something you learn very quickly on campaigns, is that you're never going to make everybody happy ever. It's not going to happen. It's a matter of percentages. And if you look at a typical congressional, a close congressional race, I mean, in some cases it's a coin flip, right? 50 basically with a couple of votes here or there, or any race on any level. And the point is, can you just get to 51% or just over 50%? And so that's the thing I think that there has to be some sort of comfort with at this point in this world that's polarized. It's also a matter of audiences too. So if you think about the different audiences that you're trying to reach, so you have your marketing audience, the people that you're trying to sell services, goods to, and then you have people that you need people to come work for you. So even if you look at corporate culture and how you communicate to your workforce, that is fundamentally political as well, because the workforce now, I mean, people don't want to work for a brand or a leader or executive that they don't find aligns with their values, right? So that's another sort of area that's been blurred a little bit too. It's your politics and your values there's always been some overlap, but I think those two things are pretty synonymous now in a lot of people's minds. So those are the sort of intersections and overlaps. And honestly, it's in some ways, kind of throwing it all into one big blender and then hitting blend and chopping it all up into a big sort of, smoothie now at this point. So I think that's where we're at is, everything is kind of political.
It's fascinating how everything becomes politicized. And one of the things, and I know you do this with your clients, we certainly do, is every message is evaluated from various points of view. So this is a really interesting dilemma I see. So we work with predominantly law firms and their clients. And one of the challenges I find is law firms have to be diverse. And they have to be diverse, not just from the standard DE&I definition, but also politically. And one lawyer may be representing an oil entity while another lawyer may be representing a sustainable investment fund, and so there's a lot of challenge with how do you share those messages. But most importantly, as you were saying, making sure that there are people who have both points of view who could look at a message and say, how is this going to be picked apart? How is it going to be politicized? And how is it going to affect our client? Do you handle things in a similar way when you're crafting messages in campaigns?
Yes, definitely. I mean, a lot of the messaging piece of the puzzle, you like to walk into that with as much data as possible. Now, that's not a panacea, right? It's not a silver bullet that's going to completely, automatically figure out your campaign blueprint or strategy, but it is something that points you in the right direction, and then trying to fit that with the overall ability of the candidate to deliver that message, because not every candidate can deliver every message or deliver every message in a certain way. And that's the same thing with executive leaders, leaders in law firms. It's just like not every person is capable of delivering messages in a humorous way or, sort of a tough way. Like everyone has their own personality. So I think what we do is with candidates in particular. So it's a little bit different in that a candidate, you come intrinsically with your own values and your own reasons for wanting to run to begin with. So that's where you start with the messaging. And there are only so many degrees of separation you can get from that sort of core area, right? So it's not always this sort of cynical of like, what do we have to say to win, no matter what? Like, what is the thing that we have to say that's going to get us over the finish line? You do start genuinely at a place where, these candidates have deeply held beliefs about certain things, deeply held values about certain things, and then you craft a message around that. Now, how you frame it is a totally different ball game, right? You can say the same thing in 20 different ways, and it can mean 20 different things to 20 different people. So that's the key then is figuring out where we can go with that message, right? The core value, and then how do you frame that in such a way? And then you do try to figure out, okay, well, who do we actually need to talk to here too? Like I said a few minutes ago, I think the thing that you have to become really, really comfortable with is the fact that you're not going to make everybody happy. And in electoral politics, a lot of times all it is a math issue. How many votes do you need? What percentage of the electorate do you need? Is it a 5-way race? Because if it's a 5-way race, you don't even need to make 50% of people happy. You just need to get to like 30% maybe for a convincing victory. Whereas if it's a head-to-head, that's a different thing. You need to figure out what sorts of issues or what sort of framing is going to appeal to the broadest number of people. And then also it depends on sort of the partisan makeup of any given district. So there are a lot of factors that go into developing those messages. But really, again, it starts from that place of like, what are these deeply held values that this candidate and life experiences and thoughts and policy prescriptives that this candidate is bringing to the table? And then how do we package that in a way that may or may not resonate with voters?
It's fantastic. We're going to take a quick break for a message from our sponsor, and we'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by Furia Rubel Communications. Recognized as the #1 agency by the National Law Journal, Furia Rubel helps top businesses and law firms with high-stakes public relations and marketing, reputation management, crisis planning, and incident response, including high-profile litigation media relations. To learn more, go to furiarubel.com or email podcast@furiarubel.com.
Welcome back to On Record PR. We're here with Matt Krayton, who is the founder of Publitics, a political and public affairs consultancy. So we're going to continue our conversation. We were talking about evaluating campaign messages. What trends are you seeing in the campaign space, and how do they impact your business or the audiences?
How long do we have here? So
pick the biggest trend.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the biggest trend, I think, is overall polarization of the electorate. So ultimately, when you're running these campaigns, especially in general elections where it's Democrat versus Republican, you're speaking to an increasingly small share of the electorate that is actually persuadable ultimately. And then the rest of it is sort of a turnout game, right? How do you activate your base to come out and actually vote? So I would say the polarization is a huge thing where it's becoming increasingly hard to break through to people who do not intrinsically share your beliefs, or they have another letter next, they have the R next to their name or the D next to their name. It's becoming increasingly hard to to crack through in that way. So there are really three big trends, I would say. So that's number one. That's the sort of overarching thing that is, I think, driving our politics today is this polarization. The second thing is more of a practical issue. It's sort of a fragmented media landscape. So, you used to be able to go on nightly news or some of the Sunday shows or whatever it is and reach a good chunk of the electorate. And you could really move opinion that way if you had a compelling message. Now, people's attention, it's divided in so many different places. So you're looking at, you have cable news, you have broadcast news, you have the morning shows, and then you have all of the social media platforms and all of the streaming services. So in terms of choices for where people can invest their attention in a given day, there are limitless options for that. And in some cases, it's in 2 or 3 places all at once. So, you're sitting there watching Netflix and you also have your phone open and you're scrolling through whatever, Instagram, or you're looking at your TikTok feed while the show is going on your TV. And then, maybe you're doing something else as well at that point. So that's making it increasingly hard to reach people and to deliver a message, because the way that the message is delivered on each of these platforms is much different. Like a thing that's going to work on TikTok and resonate with the audience there is going to be a totally different situation than what you would see someone do in an interview on one of the, Sunday shows like Meet the Press or, This Week, right? So those are some really tough challenges of figuring out like where to allocate your media dollars at this point and where can you get the biggest bang for your buck. So I think that's a huge issue just from a practical, tactical standpoint. And then the third thing is this disinformation problem that we have. So things that are demonstrably false are continuing to sort of metastasize and cause problems in our political arena. And this is true for private sector clients too. I mean, like one false tweet, one errant tweet could wipe out millions of dollars of market cap in 2 seconds, right? Based on some nonsense that someone posts, some random person posts on Twitter, for example. We saw a couple of those, right? So I think that's a huge issue too. And the problem with disinformation isn't that you can just go straight at someone who believes something that's demonstrably false and say, no, you're wrong. I mean, think about any argument that you've ever been in your personal life, right? You're having this argument and you can't just look at that person and go, you're wrong. I mean, that elicits the exact opposite reaction. It's like, oh yeah, I'm wrong. Okay, well, this is over. This conversation is over. I am entrenching myself in my position on whatever it is. I don't want to hear you anymore. So that's a hard thing to deal with, because the mediums that we have available to us to reach people, reach voters, they're not great places to have those broader, more in-depth conversations on difficult issues. So that's a huge issue going forward. It's like, okay, you have all this stuff. Like one example, that we worked on during the pandemic. This isn't political, but it was, like I said, almost everything is political and becomes political adjacent. We did a lot of public health communications around vaccinations during the height of the COVID pandemic. And the biggest issue is disinformation that would pop up on social media, because once people started to internalize all of the conspiracies and other things, it becomes very difficult in a 30-second or 15-second Instagram ad, for example, or a piece of direct mail or a television commercial to disabuse someone of that notion that they've developed as a result of, quote, doing the research. So it's a huge issue. And then, again, you push back in that way and say, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. They're just going to entrench themselves, because there's this trigger almost in the brain where it's like, well, if you're pushing back this hard on me and you're saying you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, then I must be onto something here. Like, the people behind the curtain are trying to, control the whole situation. And so it's a really fascinating problem. And the way that I think, in that case, we started to break through is like we started to, because there were different audiences that we were talking to as well during the COVID pandemic. And again, this kind of is relevant or analogous to, the electorate generally, right? So you have people who were very excited to get the vaccine, right? Like you could not get them the vaccine fast enough. Like, you didn't have to do any real communications to them other than saying, like, here's where you get it, and they'll show up and they're happy about it. I was one of those people. I was sitting around, waiting for it, and was very grateful ultimately when I was able to get that, because I mean, it's just like you see the suffering that went on during the pandemic. It's really hard to reflect on and conceptualize that something like of that magnitude happened. Like, I think collectively as it's just sort of as an aside, like collectively as a society, I don't think we processed exactly what we saw during those early days of the pandemic. I mean, it was like almost dystopian, right? Where you have these hospitals, right? You see people like dying, and then like the one person that makes it through, they have the, Here Comes the Sun playing in the hallway, and they're clapping them out, and the nurses and the doctors, they're just like trying to get through their day, like as best they can. I mean, it really is a crazy situation that we went through.
So let me ask you something. It's interesting you say all that. Without giving away your age, were you cognizant personally of what was going down when the World Trade Center was bombed?
Yeah. Yes. So I'll give away my age. So I remember exactly where I was. I was in 8th grade, which is young.
You were old enough to remember.
Oh yeah, very clearly. I was sitting in Spanish class, and I remember, I think everyone has this, like around that age and older, sort of has this memory emblazoned in their brain. But like the teacher, her face, she just went ghost white, and you could tell that there was something wrong. Like this pall kind of came over the room, and I don't think they were supposed to tell us, but like, I'm not sure she knew what to do. So she just said it.
You don't know what to do, right? Yeah. And so the reason why I asked that question, which seems so out of left field, is because I remember the end of Vietnam. I vaguely remember how jubilant my family was. I remember 9/11 like it happened yesterday. I had an 18-month-old child. And I remember those first days of the pandemic because of the fear. And we do crisis work, right? So we're closing down clients' offices overseas and witnessing. I have family in Italy, and they're posting videos of people, singing out the windows, and friends in New York, and watching, having these conversations like we are today, and listening to the ambulance after ambulance after ambulance. And so the reason why I bring that up is from a messaging perspective. Are those things that we want to keep in the mind of the voter to remove this political divide? Or in the world of politics, do we want to keep the political divide? Like, why are we so polarized? Why can't we get back to those days of 9/11 where, I mean, not of 9/11, but the way the universe showed up, people were like, we are American. We have to take care of, not to, and by any means say that, because out of the fallout of that was that many people in Arab nations and Arabs in the US were discriminated against. And that's not what I'm saying. But that idea of banding together and taking care of one another. Are we ever getting back there?
I think we can, but it's going to be a tough road to get back there. I mean, we're already seeing it, right? We're already witnessing how difficult it is to get back to a place where we have sort of a collective mission as a country. So I think there's some key differences, though, between the reaction to 9/11 and COVID. So during 9/11, you couldn't find a single leader, elected or otherwise, who would ever say that 9/11 was a good thing, or that it wasn't that big a deal, or whatever. Like, there was no one out there going, it happened, but like, we should get rid of all the scanners at the airport, and maybe we should reduce the number of TSA agents, and let people bring on planes whatever you want to bring on, because that's freedom, right? Like, that's what we want. Is freedom in this country. So like, yes, this happened, but it's got nothing to do with it. I did my research, and I think that we should be able to carry whatever we want to planes, right? You didn't hear any elected leader saying that. And I think that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing, because, clearly something did need to change there. In COVID, that was not the case. That was not the case necessarily. So I think that the difference between is like 9/11 was very easy to sort of rationalize like what was happening there. It was very concrete for people, right? So like, some bad people did a bad thing to us, it killed a whole bunch of people, knocked, the Twin Towers over and killed, more people in Pennsylvania and the Pentagon. COVID was a little bit harder because there were a lot of question marks. And once you get into science is an extraordinarily hard thing to communicate because science isn't just a thing that is, it's a process. And that's the problem that we have. And we see it with other clients too, like other thing in other spaces as well, is anytime that you have to communicate some type of science, you have to communicate the process of the science. And I don't think people appreciate how little we knew collectively, experts, other people. And I don't consider myself an expert on this, but like we were listening to a lot of experts and sitting in the room with public health officials and things like that. I don't think anyone appreciates how little they had to write the playbook from scratch with it. From scratch. They didn't know how to treat it. They didn't know exactly where it came from. Still some questions about that, but that's kind of immaterial. It's like they just didn't know how to deal with it. So the science is always going to evolve, but human beings are very uncomfortable with that idea. Uncertainty is very uncomfortable. You would rather have a negative answer, right? Something that's just like a hard no than to sit in the discomfort of uncertainty. And that makes it really hard to communicate. So I think that was part of the issue too. And then when you have that discomfort and you have that vacuum, people can jump into it very easily.
I think that's a great distinction. And I really appreciate that. This is a much longer conversation and we don't have much time left. So I'm going to go to the question that I'm curious about. We're doing a lot at our agency related to generative AI use policies in communications and for law firms. How is generative AI impacting communications on campaigns?
So I think we're going to see big time in this this upcoming cycle. So there have been a couple of examples of what I would call pretty rudimentary use of it, right? So like there's sort of this novelty still of like, okay, we created this ad with AI. So I think the RNC released an ad after the president announced his reelection campaign, and they developed this sort of like, dystopian ad from generative AI. And that was like a whole thing that they tried to do. So I think that's sort of the very basic scratching the surface first salvo in generative AI. I am less concerned about where campaigns take AI from a communications perspective, because I do think there are eventually going to be practical applications and useful applications of AI where you can really supplement what people are doing, what people are already doing, right? You can kind of amplify the expertise that people bring to it and develop multiple different versions of things to test. And I think that's very helpful. There's a lot of like testing that goes on and like how many email opens do we have for this like donation solicitation. So I think generative AI is going to be very helpful in those places. The thing that I'm most concerned about though isn't how the campaigns in good faith are going to use generative AI. It's getting good enough where you truly have to be concerned about reputational risks from bad actors using generative AI. So I'll just give you an example. You can like clone anyone's voice now. So, I mean, you could, I don't want to give anyone tips here, but like you could take my voice from this podcast and clone it pretty reliably. Interestingly enough, though, my voice doesn't quite reproduce. I don't know what it is about me, but other people who do have, I guess, more distinctive kind of voices, like they do reproduce to the point where it's not perfect. And if you really took a minute to listen, you'd be like, wait, this doesn't sound quite right. But we don't take a minute to really listen. We make these judgments in milliseconds. So you could fabricate a politician saying basically anything you want, throw it out on the internet, and that will create a whole election cycle's worth of headaches or a whole news cycle's worth of headaches for that politician.
I wonder if they're not already doing that with the phone calls that you get that are pre-recorded from your local politician or to go out and vote. I got maybe 5 of them before the May election. And I just hang up because I know who I'm going to vote for. I'm an educated voter. But B, I do not trust that it's actually their voice anymore.
Yeah, I think that definitely could be an application, and probably one of the most innocuous applications of the technology you could imagine. But then imagine taking that and having them say whatever.
And we've seen it already. So sure. It's interesting. I think generative AI is going to have it is going to have a huge impact on all industries. It's already having that impact. Lucky for the millennials out there who have grown up with tech. I worry about some of the older generations, but we have a lot of great opportunity to harness these as well in a way for good. Mm-hmm. So quick question before we wrap up. If someone wanted to get in touch with you, what is the best way to do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn. Spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, like you said. So not so much Twitter, but you can find us on Twitter, Publitics PR on Twitter. You can find us also on LinkedIn, Publitics on LinkedIn. And then we have a Facebook page as well. But that's where you can find me. Interestingly enough, you can just Google me too. I have a very unusual spelling of my last name. So I think I might be the only Matt Krayton spelled that way in the entire world. So I am the first page of Google when you come up. So those are the easiest ways to catch me if you want to.
And for our listeners, that's Krayton. So that you know, since you're listening to the podcast. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us today. Matt, I look forward to staying in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to On Record PR. Visit our website, onrecordpr.com, to subscribe to the show, share it with your friends on social media, find show notes, additional episodes, and more information. We'll see you next time. In the meantime, feel free to send us questions or show ideas at podcast@onrecordpr.com.